Imagine you're living in the early 1600s. You hear rumors about a new land across the ocean. Wild, untamed, full of opportunity. Why would anyone risk everything to go there? What could make people leave behind their homes, families, and familiar lives? Let's look into the story of how European colonies developed and expanded from 1607 to 1754, and why their choices still affect us today. Spain had one clear goal: wealth. They came to the Americas because they wanted gold and silver, hoping to become the richest nation in Europe. But how did they get that wealth? They set up the Encomienda system, which forced Native Americans to work on plantations and in mines. Spain also had another goal: converting the native people to Christianity. They believed it was their mission to save souls, but in doing so, they controlled both the people and the land. This led to the establishment of cities like Mexico City, built atop the ruins of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, where a Spanish ruling class lived in luxury, while indigenous peoples worked under harsh conditions. Less well known is the fact that Spain also implemented reducciones, or mission towns, where Native Americans were gathered and converted to Christianity. These towns, like Pátzcuaro in Mexico, served both religious and labor purposes, forcing natives into Spanish-controlled settlements. The Spanish also introduced new institutions like the mission system, which stretched from modern-day California to Texas. Junipero Serra, for instance, established a chain of missions across California, which later became major cities like San Diego and Los Angeles. Missions were more than just churches. They were centers of agricultural production, where Native Americans were taught European farming techniques. But while the missions seemed peaceful, they were often places of forced labor and cultural suppression. Visualize this: a mission courtyard bustling with Native Americans learning to farm wheat, herding cattle, or building structures, while priests oversee their spiritual conversion. But it wasn't all gold and glory. The arrival of Europeans brought diseases like smallpox, which killed off millions of Native Americans who had no immunity. The population in areas like the Caribbean and Mexico collapsed, leaving entire communities decimated. This led to what's known as the Great Dying, where up to 90% of the native population perished. The Spanish, facing labor shortages, had to rely more and more on enslaved Africans to replace native labor. By the late 1500s, Potosi, in present-day Bolivia, became one of the richest cities in the world due to its silver mines, but this wealth came at a high human cost. Thousands of native and African slaves worked in horrendous conditions in the Mita labor system, an Andean form of forced labor adapted by the Spanish. What happens when a society is built on forced labor? The consequences were long-lasting, shaping the economy and culture of places like Peru and the Caribbean for centuries. Scars of this system are still visible today, especially in regions where slavery became entrenched. While Spain was after wealth and control, the French and Dutch took a different approach. They weren't after gold or land, they wanted furs. Fur was the big commodity of the time, kind of like the oil or tech products of today. But instead of forcing people to work for them, they relied on trade alliances with Native Americans. French explorers like Samuel de Champlain and Dutch merchants in New Netherland, modern-day New York, built relationships with tribes like the Huron and Iroquois, trading European goods in exchange for valuable furs. One interesting detail is that Champlain's relationship with the Huron was so deep that he joined them in their battles against the Iroquois, using his firearms to help turn the tide. This involvement had long-term consequences, as it worsened the already existing rivalries between the native groups, driving the Iroquois towards alliances with the Dutch and later the English. French even married into local tribes to build trust and solidify partnerships. Imagine starting a small business and needing reliable partners to get your hands on valuable goods. You can't just take, you have to negotiate. This system worked well for the French, who maintained a relatively peaceful coexistence with native groups, especially around the Great Lakes and in areas like Quebec and Montreal. French coureurs de bois, or runners of the woods, like Etienne Brulé, ventured deep into the wilderness to trade directly with native communities, living among them for months or even years at a time. The Dutch, meanwhile, established Fort Orange, now Albany, and New Amsterdam, now New York City, as key trading posts. What many people don't know is that the Dutch, though focused on trade, also engaged in brutal conflicts with local native populations. The Peachtree War, for example, was a major conflict between the Dutch and the combined forces of several native tribes, including the Susquehannock, who attacked New Amsterdam in retaliation for Dutch aggression. Why didn't the French and Dutch just conquer like the Spanish? It came down to numbers. Without many settlers, they needed native allies to survive and thrive. However, their reliance on native support created fragile alliances that could quickly turn into violence if trade relationships soured. Meanwhile, the English had different motivations for colonizing. While they were still looking for wealth, many English settlers were driven by the hope of a better life. Some came seeking religious freedom, like the Pilgrims in Plymouth, while others were escaping economic hardship in England. Picture a crowded, dirty city in England, with people dreaming of wide-open land where they could farm and raise families. That's what they found in the Americas. More people, both men and women, came over compared to the French or the Dutch, settling in places like Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, the first permanent English settlement, and later, Pennsylvania, where William Penn offered land to persecuted religious groups like the Quakers. The English focused on agriculture, especially growing cash crops like tobacco and cotton. In Jamestown, tobacco became the economic engine that saved the struggling colony. John Rolfe, often known more for marrying Pocahontas, was actually the man who introduced the tobacco that thrived in Virginia's soil. But while tobacco enriched settlers, it also required vast amounts of land, leading to increased conflicts with Native Americans. English settlers saw the land as something to be owned and cultivated, unlike the French or Spanish, who were more interested in extracting resources or forming trade relationships. As English settlements expanded, conflicts arose, such as the Powhatan Wars in Virginia, where native groups resisted English encroachment, and King Philip's War in New England, one of the deadliest conflicts in colonial history. What happens when two groups want the same land? These battles over territory and resources shaped the relationship between English settlers and Native Americans for generations. Another rarely mentioned fact is that English colonies were also seen as a dumping ground for England's poor and unwanted. For example, Georgia was founded by the very interesting English parliamentarian who eventually fought for Prussia and held his dying best friend in his arms, James Oglethorpe, as a place for debtors and prisoners to start new lives. The colony also served as a buffer zone between Spanish Florida and the more prosperous Carolinas. English colonization didn't just change the land, it reshaped the global economy through a system called mercantilism. Colonies like Barbados in the Caribbean, known for its sugar plantations, were expected to supply raw materials like sugar, tobacco, and cotton to England while buying finished goods in return. Think of it as a one-way trade deal, where the colony does all the hard work and the mother country reaps most of the benefits. This system tied the English colonies to England's economy, setting up a relationship that would lead to resentment and eventually rebellion. Is it fair to always be on the losing side of a trade? The mercantile system, which benefited England at the colony's expense, planted the seeds of dissatisfaction that would explode into the American Revolution a century later. The impact of European colonization didn't stop in the 1700s. The choices Spain, France, and England made shaped the world we live in today. From the destruction of Native American cultures to the spread of African slavery, these colonies laid the foundation for modern economies, social systems, and even borders. What are the echoes of this history in the modern world? Take a look at Latin America. Many countries still speak Spanish and practice Catholicism, legacies of Spanish colonization. In Canada, the French influence remains strong, especially in Quebec, which still speaks French as its primary language. And in the United States, the descendants of English settlers built a country that eventually rebelled against the very system that created it, leading to the formation of a new nation based on principles of liberty and self-governance. But let's not forget the perspectives of those who suffered. For Native Americans, colonization meant the loss of their lands, cultures, and lives. For enslaved Africans, it meant generations of forced labor, brutality, and oppression. Why do we remember some parts of history more than others? Often, the stories of the powerful get told, while those of the oppressed are left out. But understanding these perspectives is crucial to getting the full picture of how colonization shaped the Americas and the world. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, for example, saw Native Americans in present-day New Mexico successfully drive out the Spanish for over a decade, while the enslaved Africans, who participated in the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739, fought for their freedom, challenging the brutal system of slavery. European powers came to the Americas with different goals. Spain sought gold, France and the Dutch wanted furs, and England hoped for a better life. But in the end, their actions created the same set of problems: conflict, inequality, and exploitation. From the diseases that wiped out native populations to the environmental changes caused by European farming and trade, the consequences of colonization are still with us. What started as a quest for profit or freedom turned into a lasting legacy of both progress and pain. The systems they built laid the groundwork for modern economies and societies, but they also planted the seeds of conflict and inequality that we're still dealing with today.